Good morning and welcome back. Let's start chapter 21 about blood. Let's start with the function of the blood. Blood is a connective tissue which is fluid and is used for transportation. Blood transports oxygen, CO2, nutrients, and wastes. The most important element in this transportation is oxygen. Blood also regulates your body temperature, pH, and level of fluid. For instance, when your body temperature increases, blood will be shifted toward the surface to lose heat. When it's outside is cold, blood will be shifted to the core of your body to keep the heat. Blood is a very important component to keep your pH. Blood pH is somewhere between 7.35 to 7.45. That means it's slightly alkaline. Remember, pH of 7 is neutral, anything less than 7 is acidic, and anything more than 7 is alkaline. Blood also protects us. Because blood has leukocytes or white blood cells, it can protect us against infection. Blood also contains antibodies. Now, if you take some blood and put it inside the tube and add anticoagulant to this tube, in other words, you're going to add a substance that prevents this blood from clotting. So we have blood inside the tube and we don't allow this blood to clot. And then I'm going to put this tube inside a machine. It's called a centrifuge machine, and spin it. Spin it very fast. After 5 minutes, you will see that inside the tube you have fluid at the top and you have red blood cells settled at the bottom, and between the fluid and the top and red blood cells at the bottom, you have your white blood cells and platelets. In other words, you can separate the components of the blood. Therefore, we say blood is composed of the fluid part, which is called plasma, and other elements we call it formed elements, and is composed of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. If the whole blood is 100%, if the whole thing that we have is 100%, 55% of our blood is plasma or fluid, and almost 45% is formed elements. Again, formed elements are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Out of this 45%, as you can see, 44% is red blood cells. And then less than 1% of your formed elements would be your platelet and white blood cells. The platelet and white blood cells right here is called Buffy coat. I think it's important for you to know the number of the red blood cells and the number of white blood cells and platelet. As you can see in this picture, you have 150 to 400,000 per cubic millimeter or microliter platelets. You have between 4.5 to 11,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeter or microliter. It's the same thing, microliter or cubic millimeter. And also, I think you should know that you have 4 to 6 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter or microliter. Remember, we said 55% is plasma and around 44% is red blood cells. The percentage of red blood cells is called hematocrit. Hematocrit shows how many percent of your blood is red blood cells. You can count red blood cells, or you can use the percentage of red blood cells compared to the whole blood. Let's focus on plasma now. Your plasma mainly is water. As you can see, 92% of your plasma is water. But it's not only water. Inside the plasma, you can have proteins, you can have solutes like sodium and potassium and calcium, you can have nutrients, you can have gases, you can have waste products, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot happening inside the plasma. But among all these components, the most important component that we need to talk about is protein. Protein is almost 7% of the weight of your plasma, 7%. There is so many different proteins inside the plasma, but there are three of them that we need to focus on. One is called albumin, the other one is called globulin, and the last one is called fibrinogen. Albumin is the most common one, globulin is the second most common one, and fibrinogen is going to be the third most common one. Among all the functions for these proteins, I'm going to mention one for each one. Albumin is the most important carrier of elements inside the blood. In other words, something needs to carry molecules inside the blood, and the most important carrier would be albumin. Globulin is a very diverse group of proteins. For instance, antibodies that defend us against germs are a form of globulins. To clot blood, we need different factors. We have 13 different clotting factors. Without clotting factors, you won't be able to create a clot. Some of these clotting factors are proteins, and you will learn them later. For instance, clotting factor number 2 is a protein. What type of protein? It's a globulin. So some clotting factors are globulins. There is one clotting factor, which is called clotting factor number 1. It's a protein but is not globulin, and that is fibrinogen. So let's review one more time. We have many different types of proteins in the blood. Albumin is the most common carrier in the blood. We have very diverse number of proteins under globulin. Antibodies are globulins. There are a bunch of clotting factors that are protein, and they're going to fit under the category of globulins. Fibrinogen is a clotting protein also, but is not globulin and is being classified separately. Fibrinogen is clotting factor number 1. Now let's discuss about formed elements. The first one is erythrocyte. Erythrocyte is not a very true cell because red blood cell does not have a nucleus and also doesn't have many organelles. As you know, erythrocyte or red blood cells carries oxygen. As a result, inside the cell is filled by a protein. It's called hemoglobin, and therefore there is no room for nucleus. Erythrocyte does not have ribosome or mitochondria or endoplasmic reticulum. Erythrocyte is a biconcave structure, just like this. It's biconcave. The outside, the rim, is thicker and inside is thinner. As you said, inside the red blood cells is filled by a protein is called hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin is able to carry 4 oxygens. Inside a red blood cells, we have over 280 million molecules of hemoglobin. In other words, one RBC can carry more than 1 billion molecules of oxygen. Hemoglobin is sitting at the edge of these red blood cells, not in the center. In the center, you have much less amount of hemoglobin. Therefore, the center of the red blood cells is pale color. This picture is incorrect because majority of the hemoglobin stays at the edge of the RBC. The center of RBC doesn't have that many hemoglobin. As a result, is lighter, not darker. The correct picture would be something like this. The paleness in the center of the RBC would be important because if the paleness expands, that means you have less hemoglobin at the edge. Sometimes when you look at the RBC inside the capillary, you can see they're on top of each other, just like a chips in the poker table when they put it on top of each other. This shape is called ROLU. ROLU formation is when RBC stacks on top of each other. We mentioned hemoglobin is a protein that carries oxygen. We have to understand hemoglobin is composed of 2 parts, heme and globin. Globin is a protein and heme is a structure that contains iron. So let's take a look at the protein section of this molecule or the globin. Globin is a protein composed of 4 amino acid chains. Each of these amino acid chain has a name. We call it alpha or beta. We have 2 alpha chains, alpha 1, alpha 2, and we have 2 beta chains, beta 1, beta 2. Each of this chain, that means alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, or beta 2, is attached to one molecule of heme. So therefore, we have 4 heme. Each heme, as you can see in this picture, is composed of 2 things. The ring, as you can see here, and an iron in the center. This ring is called porphyrin ring, and in the center we have iron. This iron is 2 plus iron, or it's called ferrous. If you don't have enough iron, that means you cannot produce enough hemoglobin. As a result, you don't carry enough oxygen, because each iron carries 1 oxygen. So as a result, 1 hemoglobin carries 4 oxygens because it has 4 irons. That's why the most common cause of anemia worldwide is iron deficiency anemia. Lack of iron inhibits production of hemoglobin, and if you don't have enough hemoglobin, that means you cannot carry enough oxygen. Also, it is important for you to understand that hemoglobin can carry some CO2 as well. As we mentioned, red blood cells don't have nucleus, therefore they cannot produce any protein. The protein inside the wall of the RBC gives RBC flexibility. When the RBC goes through very tiny capillaries, RBC needs to squeeze itself. When the RBC get old, these proteins will degrade. Since RBC cannot produce new protein, RBC lose elasticity. As a result, RBC cannot pass through those small capillary. Where is the smallest capillary in our body? The smallest capillary in our body is found inside the spleen or liver or bone marrow. Therefore, when the RBC gets to spleen or liver or bone marrow, to pass through those tiny capillary, it must be very flexible. After 120 days, when the RBC gets old, the RBC is going to get stuck inside the spleen or liver or even bone marrow. And as a result, the RBC will be taken away by macrophages that you find in those organs. Those organs, they have macrophages, and those macrophages, when they see RBC cannot pass through the capillary, they come and take the RBC. After phagocyte takes RBC, it's going to break down the RBC and release hemoglobin. Globin is a protein and it's composed of a bunch of amino acids. Can we recycle amino acids? The answer is yes, we can reuse amino acids to produce new proteins. And then what happens to heme? Heme is composed of, we said, iron, and a ring is called porphyrin. Can we recycle the iron? The answer is yes, we can. What is left is this ring is called porphyrin. The porphyrin ring first is going to change to a pigment it's called biliverdin, and then it's going to change to bilirubin, and finally will be secreted as part of bile. Blood typing is another topic that we need to cover today. Here is your red blood cells. Some people have some structure on top of the RBC just like this. If someone has this structure on top of the RBC, I'm going to call that person blood type A. If someone has this structure on top of the RBC, I'm going to call them blood type B. If someone has both of them, we call them blood type AB. And if someone doesn't have neither this one, A, or this one, B, we call blood type O. So what is blood type O? Blood type O is someone that does not have A nor B. But what are these that I called A or B? The nature of this structure is glycoprotein, is a protein and carbohydrate. If you have this type of glycoprotein, we call it blood type A. If you have this type of glycoprotein, you're blood type B. And if you have both of them, again, that's blood type AB. If you don't have glycoprotein A nor B, we call it type O. Now realize, these are not the only glycoprotein on the surface of RBC. There are so many of this one. So blood type O may have other glycoproteins, but doesn't have A or B. So O doesn't mean that doesn't have any glycoprotein. O means that this RBC doesn't have A or B. It may have many other type of glycoproteins. For instance, there is another type of glycoprotein on top of the RBC, and that is called antigen D, just like this one. If you're blood type A, that means you have antigen A, which is glycoprotein A, and antigen D, we call you blood type A positive. Let's say this is someone's RBC. If you do have A, we call you blood type A. If you have RH, I call you positive. If you don't have RH, just like this one, I'll call you negative. So being negative or positive depends on if you have RH or you don't have RH. This RBC has only A but doesn't have RH, so we call this one A negative. This one has A and RH, I call it positive. This RBC has B but doesn't have RH, so I call it negative. This RBC has a B and RH, so we call it positive. With the same token, this RBC has A and B but doesn't have RH, so must be AB negative. This RBC has A, B, and RH, so must be positive. And look at this one. This RBC doesn't have A or B, so it's O, but doesn't have RH either, so it's going to be negative. This RBC doesn't have A and B, but has RH, is positive. I want to make sure you understand that A, B, and RH are not the only glycoproteins. Okay, let's make sure we understand what antigen is. Antigen, by definition, is any structure or any molecule or anything that comes to your body and provoke your immune system. So let's say this is my RBC, and by mistake someone is going to give me this RBC. I need blood and someone is going to inject this one in my body. So what is going to happen? When this RBC comes to my body is going to come and check this new RBCs. And my body soon realize that this structure on top of the RBC, which is glycoprotein, is not a self structure. That means my body doesn't recognize this one. So what does my body is going to do? My body is going to create something that's called antibody that is going to come and take this antigen. So antibody is a protein that my body produces against any foreign antigen. That foreign antigen can be anything. Can be a germ, like pathogen, a virus, or it can be a bacteria, or it can be even a pollen. Anything that is foreign to my body and provoke my immune system is called antigen. So for instance, let's say this is a bacteria. This bacteria is going to come to my body. Then my immune system is going to go ahead and check this bacteria. So what does my body do? My body is going to produce antibody against this antigen. As you can see, now my antibody is going to be a perfect shape for this antigen and is going to come and fit with its antigen and take it. If another bacteria or another virus or another pathogen comes to my body, which is different than previous one, then my body is going to produce antibody that fits this antigen to be able to fight this one. If another germ comes to my body, then my body is going to produce antibody that fits that antigen. Do you think this antibody can fight against this antigen? The answer is no, because as you can see, this antibody cannot fit this antigen. Do you think this antibody can fight this one? The answer is no. So each antibody is going to fight against a specific antigen. If someone is born with blood type A, they have antibody against antigen B. They don't have antibody against A because if I create antibody against A, I'm going to damage my own RBC. So when someone is born with blood type A, they create antibody against B for future protection. If someone has blood type B, it's going to produce antibody against A for protection. If someone has blood type A and B, this person cannot produce antibody against A because it's going to damage its own RBC. And it's not going to produce antibody against B either because, again, this person has antigen B. So therefore, we say blood type AB doesn't have antibody against A or B. Blood type O, however, it doesn't have antigen A and doesn't have antigen B. Therefore, a person with blood type O produces antibody against A and antibody against B. So let's say this is my blood type. I'm blood type B. And let's say you're going to give me a blood type A by mistake. Remember, in my body I have antibody against A. So when this one comes to my body, this antibody is going to come and match this antigen, just like this. So the antibody is going to come and grab this antigen and grab this antigen from the other RBC. In other words, it's going to bring this RBC close to each other and immobile them, prevent them to move, chain them to each other. Imagine you have thousands and thousands of these antibodies, and that is going to chain RBCs into each other. That's how antibody is going to immobilize your red blood cells. This process is called agglutination. In agglutination, basically your RBCs clump and it's going to create a picture just like this. If you see something like this with the naked eye, that means agglutination happens. So when you see agglutination, that means the antibody and antigen, they matched, and as a result, antibody brought RBC together and clump them to each other. That is going to bring us to leukocyte. A leukocyte or white blood cells is a real cell. What I mean by a real cell, that means it has a nucleus and it has all the organelles that you expect inside the cell. The leukocyte sometimes leaves blood vessels and gets outside the blood vessels inside the tissue. When the leukocyte leaves blood vessels, it's called diapedesis. Diapedesis is a process of leaving blood vessels and entering the tissue. But how leukocyte knows that there's a germ outside the blood vessels and gets out to fight? Well, the answer is when the infection gets to your body cells get damaged. Damaged cell release some chemical, is called chemotaxins, and these chemotaxins attracts white blood cells to the site of injury. The process of attracting white blood cells to the site of injury is called chemotaxis, but the chemical is called chemotaxins. We classify leukocytes in two groups. A group with granule is called granulocyte, and another group without granule is called agranulocyte. A means without. If you don't have granule, we call it agranulocyte. If you do have granule, we call it granulocyte. If you look at this diagram, you can see these three cells. Inside the cytoplasm, they have some granules. These are granules. This one also has granule. This one also has granule. That's why we call these three granulocyte. Is a cell site with granule. But these two, as you can see, they don't have granule. That's why we call these two agranulocytes. In the lab, they're going to teach you how to recognize these cells from each other. But for now, I want to introduce you to granulocyte. There are three of them: neutrophil, eosinophil, and basophil. Agranulocytes are lymphocytes and monocytes. In this picture, this is your neutrophil with granulocyte. This is your eosinophil. This is your basophil. All three of them, they have granule. This is your lymphocyte, and this is the monocyte. These two, they don't have granule. That's why it's called agranulocyte. If we go back to this picture, you can see the percentage of each of these granulocytes, and I want you to know them. Neutrophil is the most common white blood cell. 50 to 70% of your white blood cell is neutrophil. The second most common one is lymphocyte, 20 to 40%. Monocyte is between 2 to 8%. Eosinophil between 1 to 4%. And basophil is the rarest one, and that is between 0.5 to 1%. And that is going to bring us to the last type of formed element in the blood, and that is called platelet. Platelet is not a cell either. Platelet is a fragment of a big cell. It's called megakaryocyte. Let's take a look at this one. This is a megakaryocyte. It's found in the bone marrow. A platelet is a small piece of this one. If you pinch off a piece of this cytoplasm, each of these pieces is called platelet. One megakaryocyte can create up to 3,000 platelets. These dots that you see here, these are a piece of this cell, which is called megakaryocyte. A platelet famously is used for blood clotting. And the last part of this chapter and this discussion is about hemopoiesis. Poiesis means formation, hemo means blood. In other words, we're going to talk about how we create blood. For that reason, I like to look at this table. Inside the bone marrow, we have a stem cell. It's called hemocytoblast, or it's called pluripotent stem cell. Hemocytoblast or pluripotent stem cell is a grandpa for all blood components, including white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. Let's see how this one happens. We don't need to go through so much of detail on this one, but I tell you the most important aspect of this table. Hemocytoblast first is going to divide to two cells. One is called lymphoid stem cell, another one is called myeloid stem cell. Lymphoid stem cell is pretty easy because at the end it's going to create lymphocytes. All lymphocytes comes from lymphoid stem cells. Myeloid stem cells produce the rest of the formed elements. In other words, it's going to create erythrocyte, platelets, granulocytes, neutrophil, eosinophil, basophil, and monocyte. So one more time, lymphoid stem cell only produce lymphocytes. Myeloid stem cells produce red blood cells, platelets, and the rest of white blood cells includes granulocytes and monocytes. But how? Well, myeloid stem cells later on, due to the effect of different type of chemical, which are called colony stimulating factor, CSF, can create three different type of progenitor cells. So progenitor cells are derived from myeloid stem cells due to different type of chemical. It's called colony stimulating factor. The first progenitor cells is called CFU-E, which is this one. CFU stands for colony forming unit, and this progenitor at the end is going to create erythrocyte. Another progenitor is called CFU-MEG for megakaryocyte, and at the end is going to create platelet. And the last progenitor is called CFU-GM, creates monocyte and the rest of granulocyte. It's called CFU-GM because G stands for granulocytes and M stands for monocyte. I think the last thing I want to tell you about this table is every time you hear the word blast means immature cell. The word cyte means a mature cell. So first we have erythroblast and then we have erythrocyte. We have megacardioblast and then we have megakaryocyte that produces platelets. In the case of CFU-GM, we said they're going to create two lines. One line is going to create granulocyte and the other one line is going to create monocyte. This cell is called monoblast because immature, and then it's going to create monocyte. This cell is called myeloblast, and myeloblast at the end is going to create eosinophil, basophil, and neutrophil. And that is going to bring us to the end of this discussion. The rest of this one would be for physiology. Have a good day.